Everyone. Welcome to this week's module number 3, where we're going to be talking about chapter 9, which is collecting and analyzing qualitative data. Now, I'm going to say this right up front, just so we're all on the same page. This is talking about how you would collect and how you would analyze some qualitative data, which, as we know, qualitative data is that quality data. It's in-depth through the use of interviews and interpreting people's words. But just because we're learning about collecting and analyzing that data does not mean that we ourselves are going to be going out and doing it. I think that's a slight misconception about these weekly projects or deliverables that you guys are providing. We're creating a research proposal. We're not necessarily creating something that we're going to complete. So let's say you wanted to do research on market trends related to commercials for the Super Bowl time, because that's happening. That just happened. Well, you're not going to actually go out. You're not going to interview people asking, hey, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on that? Instead, what you're doing is it's as if you're creating a proposal to tell someone, hey, this is what I would like to do for research, and seeking approval through maybe an internal review board or an exempt review committee if our institution had one. So I just want to make that part clear. So with that part out of the way, and now that we're all in the same understanding that we're just creating a research proposal, not actually conducting research, let's jump on into this chapter. So there are some key issues in qualitative data analysis. Qualitative research is often viewed as less precise than quantitative research. And that's because qualitative research is interpreting people's words. You're essentially reading between the lines. So if you interview someone and they say that flexible working arrangements are offering them more access to family events, well, you're interpreting what that means is that being able to work from home or have a flexible working schedule is allowing that individual to engage more with their family. They didn't say the exact words, I'm engaging more with my family, but in one way or another, they did say that they're more engaged with their family. So it's that analysis and interpretation that we're getting. Whereas in quantitative research, that's numerical, that's statistics, that's yes or no, true or false, definitive answers. That's saying, do you prefer this or do you prefer that? Do you like this or do you not like that? This qualitative data is governed by clear rules and offer a way of exploring issues that can't be expressed by numbers. It lacks a set of structures which allows for more exploratory possibilities. So you're able to ask someone an open-ended question, and in some instances, you're allowed to follow up. So in the case for semi-structured interview questions, you're able to ask, what does flexible working arrangements provide to you? And if, let's say, you're interviewing a mother and she said that she's much more likely, if she can go in late or come in early and leave early, to be able to attend her family or children's events, well, then you're able to then say, why is that important to you? You're able to come up with questions on the fly and interpret and expand on what was already mentioned. Quantitative data has its place in research, as does qualitative data. They both have their cases, they both have their uses. They're distinctive, but they're both important. And you can technically use both of these together, but that would be called a mixed methods approach. For our purposes, and for our weekly project deliverables that we have, we are just going to be using qualitative research. We're not going to use quantitative. We don't want to bring in statistics. That's a whole nother discussion, and that would be a higher level class, and it would ramp up the difficulty. So I recommend staying with quantitative research because oftentimes it fits better for business cases. There's not a lot of instances where we're able to use quantitative data for what we would be utilizing for our research proposals. So that's why we stick with qualitative. So a major issue facing qualitative data is researcher influence. So this is essentially our influence that we're having on the data. So like I said, this isn't looking at a yes or no, true or false question. You have to interpret what somebody is saying. So it leads up to the researcher to actually provide and interpret that data accurately without their own bias. Now, unfortunately, we all have bias. Regardless of what that bias is, how strong that bias may be, we all have preferences. And we all want our research to reign true and want our hypothesis to reign true. However, it's essential that we reflect on ways that our researcher bias could influence our results. So, taking into account what we feel and how to avoid that misinterpretation. So, let's say the topic, I myself, I really like renewable energy. Okay, and I'm doing research on renewable energy in this market. All right, and I start doing qualitative research. And I start interviewing people, and I start representing the data in a way that could be biased. I want my hypothesis to be true, and I would like renewable energy to come to this community. Well, I may be biased by misinterpreting information and saying and showing results that say this area wants renewable energy, even if this area does not desire renewable energy. It's easier to avoid this researcher influence in quantitative data because you're able to just interpret the numbers as they are. Scale on 1 to 5, how strongly do you feel about renewable energy? 5 being very strong, 1 being not so strong. You can't misinterpret that. It's either it's a 4 or it's a 2, it's a 5, 1, 3, whatever it may be. You can't misinterpret that number. Like I said, this influence is affected by our standpoint, beliefs, desires, results, whatever we're looking for, wherever we stand, whatever our political beliefs are, they all play an influence in our research. And that's why we need to be very clear and explicit about the methods of our research, because we're much more likely to be represented and viewed upon as unbiased if we show good information and show how we got our results. So there are different types of qualitative methods: action research, appreciative inquiry, case study, ethnographic research / participant observation, focus groups, interviews, and those interviews could be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured, life history research, participant diaries, structured observation. All these different kinds are qualitative methods that you could one day experience or utilize if you were to go into academic research. So let's talk about the first one, action research. So this is going to involve researcher as an active participant in the situation under study. So the researcher would incorporate themselves into the situation they are attempting to study. So if you want to study how a new policy is being implemented or viewed upon in a workplace, then you could go like undercover boss, essentially, and go in, fly under the radar, and view how people are viewing that. You could also be transparent about it. So just putting yourself in that work situation, telling everyone why you're there, trying to get a feel for what this new policy is. And it's useful to help all those involved in the situation being studied to better understand what is happening. So, being transparent, telling them, here's why I'm here. I want to benefit you guys. Here's why I want to benefit you guys. So I'm going to observe you. So it involves a 3-step process. The planning, figuring out how you're going to get there, how that's going to work. Are you part of the company? Are you going to go do it in another company? Do you need clearances? Things like that to get to the situation that you're trying to put yourself in. Taking action step, that's actually implementing whatever you're trying to implement. And then after you've collected the data, the 3rd step is reflecting on those results. And it's a cycle of continual mapping, feasibility, implementation, and improvement. So constantly re-looking at your research to try and figure out, okay, what am I doing? Is this correct? Is this not correct? How can I improve upon this? And you oftentimes improve your research as you're going along if you're not academic, because you don't need to follow those steps as much if you're just a business interviewing your customers. A case study will involve more than one way of deriving data about a case or organization. It may include collecting and analyzing documents, talking to people, getting survey data, participant observation, as we mentioned, consumer research, and it investigates a single subject at a more detailed level. So it takes something very or hyper specific and it goes real deep into it. It dives deep into that information. Appreciative inquiry is a more recent development in qualitative research methods. It focuses on what is right about a situation versus others that focus on what's wrong. So this type of information or research focuses on what's good about this organization or company, what's good about this department or this new policy, and how do we improve upon it. It involves 4 steps: discover and focus what's good, why it's good. The dream and envision. So then this is the dream or envision step is you're trying to figure out ways that it would best implement. What is your dream or vision for implementing maybe a policy? Design your research methods based around this, and then deploy and implement whatever you've created, whatever you've come up with throughout these 4 steps. Ethnographic research comes from a study of anthropology and has plenty of ethical issues to go along with this. We're not going to dive too much into this. I just want you guys to be aware that this is a type of research that exists. There are different approaches to qualitative analysis, such as analytical induction, cognitive mapping, data display analysis, discourse analysis, feminist research, grounded theory, histography, narrative analysis, phenomenography, phenomenology, or template analysis. We're going to talk about some of these. And now, just to be clear, these are not comparing. I just wanted to try and reduce the number of slides we had to go through. So I put multiple on each slide. So, an approach called analytical induction is a systematic analysis of text or other qualitative data to build categories and subcategories within existing data. It attempts to construct rich and in-depth picture from the data that you find. So, you're essentially taking information and putting it into categories and then categorizing those categories with subcategories within data that already exists. And it's trying to develop that picture, giving you a good sense of what's going on. Cognitive mapping is determining how individuals construct mental models. It uses visual or spatial means to produce a map of relationships between concepts as understood by the subject. When we talk about data, display, and analysis, this is analyzing data by first reducing qualitative data to a simple set of ideas. So taking qualitative data, breaking it down into its fundamental ideas, breaking it down into different pieces so we can look at them a little bit more clearly. And it displays those ideas in order to draw and check conclusions from that data. Discourse analysis is analyzing language used by subjects to determine how the world of a subject is constructed through the use of language. So this looks at discourse and analyzing discourse between maybe 2 individuals or a group, maybe a group of different speaking individuals. Feminist research is seeing reality through the perspective of gender and attempts to revise how organizations are understood, challenging male-oriented values and paradigms. Now, this was a massive thing not too long ago when there was a lot of gender inequality. So it essentially was looking at the view through essentially a woman's perspective when this originally started. So if you look at policies of a business from 90 years ago, those policies wouldn't account for things like maternity leave, sick days related to a woman's body, and it wouldn't account for the workplace through the eyes of another gender. So this research does exactly that. Grounded theory is an inductive approach to build theory from data, usually from interviews or observations. Various versions exist, but the principal method is to code phenomenon within the data, an example being an interview transcript, and to repeatedly revisit the data in order to refine and saturate the categories derived before meaningful theory can be built. So, in other words, you would maybe be looking at an interview transcript. So, if you interviewed someone, you would have to, in proper research, transcribe that interview and then start looking at that interview. You would find data, and then you would refine data, and you would continue to look through this interview until you can't find any more important pieces of data to you. So it's not just reading through an interview one time. It's reading through it, taking a break, coming back to it, seeing what else you can find until there's saturation. And that saturation is finding enough data that essentially you're repeating what you're finding. It's like a sponge. If you were to soak a sponge in water, you are going to be able to squeeze that sponge and get a ton of water out of it that's saturated with water. However, if you only put a sprinkling of water on a sponge and then squeezed it, well, you're only going to get a little bit of water out. And maybe you might not even get any water out because the sponge isn't that saturated. If it's highly saturated, which is what we're looking for in research, there's so much data in that sponge that we could then squeeze out and essentially put into words through our research. Histography is the study of historical methods. When revisiting an event, this would mean analyzing the epistemological position taken when versions of the event are written. So maybe looking at articles that were written shortly after September 11th about the economy, and then or marketing even, and then looking at that maybe a year later, and then 5 years later, and then 10 years later, because these new articles and journal articles are going to be written constantly, and as time goes on, they're going to be interpreted in different ways. In narrative analysis, you're collecting and analyzing qualitative data without fragmenting it. The method preserves the narrative or story of the data to maintain a sense of time, place, and sequence in the data. So, in narrative analysis, you kind of keep a lot of that contextual information. So, typically, when you're going through transcriptions of your interviews, you're saying, okay, here's a quote that I want to pull out to talk about and analyze. Whereas in narrative analysis, you're looking at the entire picture. You're looking at the entire story, not just one piece of that story. It's meant to preserve whatever story the participant was trying to portray to us. Phenomenography seeks to describe the way different people view a phenomenon, is based on taking an interpretive approach to interviewed data, and its aim is to develop an intense picture of the phenomenon by defining the outcome space and investigating relationships within that space. Phenomenology is the approach of social phenomenon from the perspective that they are socially constructed. So it looks at that social construct aspect. And is concerned with discerning meaning within the phenomenon and trying to put aside researchers' prior understanding of that phenomenon. So it's taking your perspective out of the equation. It's trying to take out what you think you know about a situation so that way you can get a clear, unbiased opinion with some good data. Template analysis. This is a creation of a hierarchy of categories from the data, using this as a template to explore qualitative data. So, a couple notes. We talked about a lot of different approaches to qualitative analysis. These approaches may overlap with one another. So you may get maybe the feminist approach mixed with a historical approach to qualitative analysis. Methods listed are distinct, but they all involve a rigorous attempt to look at qualitative data, which offer a range of research interpretations. Reason why qualitative analysis must therefore be as rigorous and transparent in methods as possible is to allow the readers of such research to understand how conclusions and findings are achieved. So the reason we're so thorough, the reason we have so many steps and processes and we try and interpret and explain everything as clearly as possible is so that individuals reading our paper, your paper, they can understand the conclusions that you are making and understand how you found the information that you found. May not be exactly reproducible in terms of your research. Your research may not be exactly reproducible, but that doesn't invalidate the results necessarily. So what are key operations required in qualitative data analysis? Where data is derived from interviews. So this is important in terms of data analysis. You also need to develop themes and categories or ideas of your data analysis. So when you're looking through these interviews and you're understanding what people are saying, you need to create themes and categories. These would be your headings and subheadings in a paper. You're going to utilize coding to find units of meaning within the idea or the data which relate to and add to or amend the categories. So as you're going through, you're going to essentially code data. So you're going to say that, okay, this quote will fall under this category, this heading, this idea, this theme. This constant comparative of these methods is leading to saturation of these categories. So you're trying to find all this information so that you could saturate whatever themes and categories and ideas that you've come up with and have identified are important to your research. So as I mentioned, your research is gonna, if you were to actually interview people, you will require some form of transcription. So there are a couple ways you can do this. You can pay someone to transcribe your interview data. Now, I'll tell you that's what I did because I thought, I was like, all right, my participants, I have about 12 of them. The interviews are roughly 15 minutes long. I could probably transcribe that, but they need to be transcribed word for word. And after about 15 minutes, I only got about 3 minutes into the actual the recording of the interview. So I ended up paying a company to transcribe them for me. If you were going to transcribe them, which I recommend if you have plenty of time before the due date of whatever paper you're writing, if you're transcribing them, make notes of nonverbal interventions and interruptions. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. When you're transcribing, you're going to make note of any nonverbal interventions or interruptions. And why is this important? Well, so first off, to clarify, if you were in the interview with someone and someone were to walk in and interrupt your interview, you would want to make note of that. Why is this? That's because you want to have a firm understanding of where the participant was mentally pre and post that intervention. So, you've been talking to someone before and you've been having a good conversation and maybe someone comes up, says hello to you. How are you doing? I have to be on my way. Have a good day. You go back to your original conversation and you say, what were we talking about? And you might have lost your train of thought or that specific thought you were trying to portray. So making note of that could be useful for you. Taking notes of observations and interviews may be sufficient, but a transcription of the conversation is a much more important for your conversations. So these transcriptions are going to be super important, especially when you're reviewing the data. To record an interview, to then transcribe later, you'll require a suitable instrument. An instrument should not be too intimidating, so you don't want them to come into a room with this big recording machine because they might be like, whoa, what's going on here? And they might be a little bit hesitant. They may pay attention to it too much during the interview and not give you their full attention. It needs to be reliable. So you can't use a cell phone from about 20 years ago because that is not going to be very reliable unless it's a Nokia phone. And at that point, you could probably record the interview and then throw it off a building and it'd be okay. And it has to have a mic that can pick up everyone's voice clearly. Now, when I say that, if you're going to be doing focus groups, meaning that there's going to be a table of some kind with people around it, your microphone on whatever device needs to be able to pick up everybody clearly. Now, for me, what I used my cell phone in a recording app because I had a great microphone. I could put it in the middle of the thing. People don't really pay too much attention to it because it's just a normal phone, so they don't get distracted by it. And when you're going to record people, you need to get their permission and consent to record. Otherwise, your data could be invalidated. So, utilizing computers for data analysis. Computers can help us analyze qualitative data through things like qualitative data analysis software. CAQDAS is one that comes to mind. This probably won't reduce the analysis time of interpreting the data, but it can be helpful for large amounts of data. It can produce qualitative data that has been collected from qualitative methods. The software, what it does is it organizes the data and allows the researcher to find and search for keywords and phrases. So it will do some of the legwork for you, but you still have to actually read it, put the data together, and interpret that data, and potentially it'll take you longer than if you just did it your own way. But it will save you time in other respects. There are some that can be integrated into Word and Excel, and it can help you identify themes a little bit easier by essentially looking for keywords across multiple interviews. Now, I have never used this, and this, for the research I've done, seems like it's a little bit too intense. However, if you were going to be looking at a population of maybe 50 plus individuals, this could really help you find some themes that you otherwise may miss. The QSR is an international producer software called NVivo, or NVIVO, and it allows you researchers to use a computer to organize and analyze the findings from qualitative and mixed methods research. And this kind of software is designed for open-ended questions. So it's not designed for yes or no's, true or false, scales of 1 through 5. It's what are your feelings on a matter? What are your thoughts on this event? And it takes that data set and organizes them for the researcher. So, when we evaluate and summarize our research literature, we need to watch out for our own bias. As I mentioned earlier, you have your opinions, you have your thoughts, and you have beliefs on any given matter. If you think of it and you've heard of it before, you have an opinion. And if you give it enough thought and you've never heard of it before, you'll probably form an opinion. And it's important to remove our own bias and think without that bias, and only think with the data that exists in the literature that we find and that we collect through interviews. This bias can oftentimes impact an individual's perception of the results of studying or the existing literature out there. It's really important to try and remove that bias as best as possible. We need to be cognizant of the limitations of the research and the research results that we find. So a conclusion made in location X, such as India, may or may not apply to other groups found in location Y, such as Canada. So just because in India we found this statement to be true, that does not mean that people in Canada are going to find that same statement true, or we won't find it true with that population. That's because India and Canada, two very different countries, very different cultures, very different norms, they're different. And it's important to look carefully at each study you use to make sure it is relevant to your research questions. So now let's talk about the project deliverables for the weeks. This is titled Notes. So you're going to open up your research document, and you could look at the directions on Canvas for a better description of all this. But essentially what you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking notes on the research articles that you found so far. So you should have submitted 12 articles this previous assignment with 3 to 5 sentence summary of that article. Well, now you're actually going to go in and you're going to find a couple pieces of information within those articles. So you'll make 2 to 3 notes using your own words, and you're not going to use quotes initially. You want 2 to 3 notes of your own words because that's going to help you later on. However, even though here and on Canvas it says don't use quotes, you can find quotes after you put 2 to 3 notes together of your own words. Typically, those quotes are going to back up what you're saying. I would recommend using bullets to separate your notes under the source references, so separating everything. Maybe start putting things into categories, so you make a note, throw it under category X, and put a little reference there saying that this is from article number 3. Focus on the main points or findings of the study, often found in the introduction section, can be found in the conclusion section. There's typically that middle section where it has a bunch of technical jargon, a lot of statistical analysis, things of that nature. Honestly, just skip pretty much all of that. If you want to read it, that's fine. I just know that for our purposes, we are on a time crunch, and oftentimes those areas that talk about statistical analysis typically don't really yield good results for us. It's usually in the introduction and the summary sections of the paper, or the interpretation of that data section, which is usually found towards the end. Once you have those 2 to 3 notes, jump to the next source on your list and repeat, rinse and repeat until you do it for all your articles that you have. You're also going to get rid of any sources that just aren't working out and don't fit with what you're doing. And that's to be expected. You found 12 articles, but that doesn't mean that as you read through them, you're going to utilize all 12 of them. You're only going to utilize ones that you think are actually relevant now. Hopefully, majority of them are. If you cut out half of them, well, you're probably going to have to go find a couple more articles. So if you have to change up your articles, that's totally acceptable.